Hi everyone, and a very good morning. Welcome to this month's Patch Tuesday webinar by Managing. So here's a quick intro about me. I am Anupam Kundu, a product specialist at Manage Engine, and today I'll be your presenter. I'm also assisted by an expert panel who would be answering all your queries throughout the webinar. So dear guests, if you have any queries regarding the webinar, the products, any of our products or the presentation, please feel free to ask via chat. Also, I would like to tell you that the webinar is going to be for a 60-minute session. That is, it's going to be a 60-minute session, and also the webinar is being recorded. The webinar recording would be sent to your registered email IDs along with the presentation slide deck in 1 to 2 working days. All right, so without further ado, let's start with the agenda of today's Patch Tuesday webinar. So first up, we'll have a quick glance at the latest ransomware attacks as well as the number of vulnerabilities that have been reported in the recent times. After that, we'll have a look at the end of life dates for the various Windows versions. Followed by that, we'll have a detailed breakdown of February 2023's Patch Tuesday updates. And then we'll also demonstrate how you can simplify patch management for your enterprise's networks using Manage Engine's Patch Manager Plus. Next up, we'll be sharing the best practices for patch management in a hybrid setup or network that you can use. And also, last but not the least, we'll have a live question and answer session wherein myself as well as the expert panel would be answering all your queries related to patch management, the presentation, or any of our products. Okay, so let's begin with the ransomware news. First up, we see that Mortal Kombat is making the headlines again. And this time it's not actually the game, but this time it's a ransomware. So this new ransomware is based on the Zorist commodity ransomware family that utilizes a builder that lets the threat actors customize the malware. Now recently, attacks by this ransomware has been observed mainly in the United States. Also, some of the sightings have been reported in Turkey, UK, and the Philippines. Now, speaking of the ransomware, it is generally being delivered through phishing attacks, wherein the email contains a zip attachment. So once downloaded, that is, once the attachment is downloaded and opened, the payload is delivered. Next up, we have seen reports on the last week, that is, on the last Wednesday of last week, on the 8th of February, we have seen reports that the city of Oakland faced a ransomware attack. Now, as a consequence, the city was forced to take down all of its IT systems. Unfortunately, the attack affected only the non-emergency services. And as per the city's administration, so they have stated that the incident did not affect their core services, that is 911 dispatch as well as fire and emergency resources. All of these are working as expected. Now, while many systems that were taken offline previously due to this threat are still down, the city has recently declared a state of emergency. Now, coming to the last ransomware news item, we see a ransomware attack on the heritage provider network in California, which led to sensitive patient data being exposed to the cyber criminals. Now, the sensitive patient data has been exposed from multiple medical groups under the heritage provider network chain. And as per the reports, as many as 3 million sensitive patient data was breached. So as for the cause, according to a third-party cybersecurity expert, as per the investigation, the cause was found to be a malware that had infected the organization's servers. So, dear guests, all of these above incidents clearly point out how important it is to have a ransomware detection and protection solution for your networks. In this regard, I would also like to tell you that we are glad to announce that Manage Engine's flagship endpoint management and security solution, that is Endpoint Central, now supports ransomware mitigation and protection capabilities with the new anti-ransomware module. So the anti-ransomware module has been released and is available for general public. So in case you want to know more about it, you can refer to the link that has been shared in the chat. And in case you want a customized demonstration of the anti-ransomware module of the Endpoint Central product, you can simply drop in your email IDs in the chat and we'll be setting up a demo session as per your convenience. All right, that's enough with the latest ransomware news. Now let's talk about the Microsoft support and the Windows lifecycle. So last patch Tuesday, we saw that Windows 7 reached its end of life. That is, the extended security updates, ESUs, for Android 7 were discontinued by Microsoft last patch Tuesday. So we can officially say that Windows 7 is dead now. Along with it, Server 2008 and 2008 R2 also reached end of life, the earlier patch Tuesday. However, Microsoft has also announced that they'll be supporting another one additional year of ESU support for Server 2008 and 2008 R2 only if they're running in Azure. Along with that, older versions of Windows 10, that is Windows 10 21H1 for enterprises, educations, and Home Pro and Pro for workstations, and Windows 10 version 20H2 for Home Pro and Pro for workstations. They had reached their end of lives on 13th December 2022 and 10th May 2022, respectively. So users who are still on these old versions of Windows 10, it is highly recommended that you migrate to newer versions, that is Windows 11 22H2, as well as Windows 10 22H2. All right, now let's have a look at the Patch Tuesday breakdown for this month's Patch Tuesday updates. So this time, as a Valentine's Day gift, Microsoft has given us updates for 77 vulnerabilities through 143 patches. Along with that, I would like to mention that if these patches are left unpatched, these can cause 7 different impacts on the vulnerable devices. And also, Microsoft has released 80 different articles this time. We'll discuss in depth about all of these updates in the later slides. I see some of the attendees joining now. So for those who are joining late, there's nothing to worry because the webinar is being recorded. And we'll be sending the recording of the webinar as well as the presentation's slide deck to your registered email IDs in 1 to 2 working days. Also, I'd like to announce again that if you have any queries regarding the presentation or patch management in general or any of our products, please feel free to ask via chat. Moving on, let's take a look at the 0 days patched. So this month, out of the 77 vulnerabilities that have been patched, we have seen 3 0 days and 9 critical vulnerabilities. Now, first, let's talk about the 3 0 days that have been patched. But I would like to mention at first that all 3 of these 0 days this time are being actively exploited. So let's start with CVE 2023-21823. So this Windows graphics component is a remote code execution vulnerability that is being actively exploited in the wild. And as for Microsoft, an attacker who successfully exploited this vulnerability could gain system privileges. Now, since the security update will be pushed out to users via the Microsoft Store and rather than the normal Windows update, so customers who have disabled the automatic updates in the Microsoft Store, for them, they won't be receiving the update automatically. I would like to repeat again that this update will be pushed out through the Microsoft Store. So for those users who have disabled the automatic updates in the Microsoft Store, they won't be receiving the update automatically. And as of now, while the vulnerability is being actively exploited in the wild, it hasn't been publicly disclosed. Coming to the next 0 day vulnerability in Microsoft Publisher, tracked by CVE 2023-21715. This is also being actively exploited and can cause security feature bypass in the vulnerable systems. Now, again, as per Microsoft, an attacker who successfully exploited this vulnerability could gain system privileges. So this 0 day in Microsoft Publisher allows a specially crafted document to bypass Office macro policies that block untrusted or malicious files. Now, once the flaw is exploited, macros in the malicious publisher document would run without warning the users. Further, Microsoft has also explained that the attack can be carried out locally by a user that has authentication to the targeted system. Now, on the other hand, that is for the unauthenticated attackers, that is the unauthenticated users, they could lure in the victims through social engineering attacks such as phishing. And as of now, while this vulnerability is being actively exploited, the public exploit hasn't been disclosed yet. Coming to the last of the zero-day vulnerability in Windows Common Log File System driver, we see that this elevation of privilege vulnerability has been tracked as CVE 2023-23376. And speaking of this actively exploited zero-day, Microsoft again explains that an attacker who successfully exploited this vulnerability could gain system privileges. So this end of privilege bug is likely being chained with another remote code execution. I beg your pardon. Is this end of this elevation of privilege bug is likely being chained with another remote code execution bug to spread malware or ransomware, and this might also be used as advanced threat actors. Since all of these 3 0 days are being actively exploited, it is highly recommended that the vulnerabilities should be patched as soon as possible. So that's enough with the zero-day vulnerabilities. Now let's take a look at the critical vulnerability. So as I mentioned earlier, that this time we have 9 critical vulnerabilities out of the 77. But here you can see CVE 2023-21808 is affecting 2 different components. Let's explain in detail. I'll pause for a while. I'll be slow on these slides so that you can make a note or take a snapshot of these CVIDs as well as the components. And again, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to remind that if you have any queries, please feel free to ask via the question and answer panel that is on the left side of your window. I see a few questions right now. Our expert panel would be answering those shortly. Okay, so now talking about the critical vulnerabilities. So first up, let's talk about CVE 2023-21808, 21815, and 23381. So these .NET and Visual Studio vulnerabilities can cause remote code execution. And while Microsoft has not revealed any detailed information about these vulnerabilities, based on the limited information that is available, we can tell that these 3 vulnerabilities, that is CVE 2023-21808, 21815, and 23381, these seem similar in nature and require an attacker to trick the victim to trigger the vulnerability to execute code in the context of the application. Next, talking about the CVE 2023-21718, that is the vulnerability that has been found in Microsoft SQL ODBC driver. This again is a remote code execution vulnerability, and it affects the Open Database Connectivity interface. So as we all know that the Microsoft Open Database Connectivity, that is ODBC interface, allows applications to access data from various types of database management systems. Now, this vulnerability can be exploited by an attacker, tricking an unauthenticated user into connecting to an that is attacker controlled rogue database. I would like to repeat that this vulnerability can be exploited by an attacker, and they can trick an unauthenticated user into connecting to an attacker control, that is to a rogue SQL database. Now the attacker can then return the malicious data to the client, that is to the user, and cause arbitrary code execution on it. Next, for CVE 2023-21716, I'd like to change the slide. On the screen, you can see the other 5 critical vulnerabilities. So talking about CVE 2023-21716, so we see this Microsoft Word vulnerability that can cause remote code execution. Now, it has to be noted that CVE 2023-21716 affects both Microsoft SharePoint as well as Microsoft Office applications. Now, this vulnerability can be used in a preview pane attack, and an attacker can send a malicious RTF payload that is via mail. That is, again, it's a phishing attack. It can be exposed. It can be exploited by a phishing attack. So an attacker can send a malicious RTF payload via mail that allows the attacker to execute commands without minimal or zero user interaction. Now, Microsoft has also provided a workaround for this vulnerability. So administrators need to enforce a Microsoft Office file block policy to prevent opening RTF documents from the unknown or untrusted sources. I would like to repeat that Microsoft's recommended workaround for this vulnerability is that the admins need to enforce a Microsoft Office file lock policy so that they can prevent opening RTF documents from unknown or untrusted sources. Talking about the other critical vulnerabilities, we see CVE 2023, 21692, 21690, and 21689. So the Microsoft Protected Extensible Authentication Protocol, that is PEAP, the vulnerabilities have been found in this component, and this can again cause remote code execution. So we all know that Microsoft PEAP is a secure implementation of the Extensible Authentication Protocol, which provides the encryption and authenticated TLS tunnel, that is the transport layer security tunnel. So particularly CVE 2023, 21692, and 21690, these can be exploited by sending specially crafted malicious packets. But speaking of CVE 2023-21689, this can be used to target server accounts through network calls to execute code remotely. Now, all three of these vulnerabilities, do note that all three of these vulnerabilities do not require any special privileges or user interaction. All right, now coming to the last critical vulnerability. Ladies and gentlemen, I guess there's some issue with the screen share. Could you kindly confirm if my screen is visible? Ladies and gentlemen, I believe there was some issue with the screen share. Could you kindly just send a thumbs up if my screen is visible? All right, all right. Thank you. Thank you so much for the responses. Sorry for these hiccups. Okay, so let's continue. So I was talking about the last critical vulnerability, that is CVE 2023-21803. Now this Windows ISCSI Discovery Service, this is a vulnerability in the Windows ISCSI Discovery Service. And again, this can cause remote code execution. Now, as we all know, that Windows ISCSI Discovery Service is a Windows service that allows non-SMB clients to access storage on a Windows host. Now, talking about the vulnerability, do note that this vulnerability affects only 32-bit versions of Windows. All right. So the vulnerability can be exploited by sending a maliciously crafted DHCP discovery request to a Windows host running the ISCSI discovery service. So once it's successfully exploited, it will allow an attacker to execute code remotely. And the vulnerability can be only exploited if the ISCSI initiator client application is running. I would repeat that the CVE 2023-21803, this remote code vulnerability, can only be exploited if the ISCSI initiator client application is running. And also tell you that the ISCSI initiator client application is not enabled by default in the systems. All right, so we are done with the critical vulnerabilities. Let's move on further and take a look at the other Patch Tuesday updates. So here's a look at the operating systems and applications affected. So as I already mentioned earlier, we have 77 vulnerabilities this time, starting with 3 in apps, Microsoft Apps, 4 in Microsoft Azure. Again, we have vulnerabilities in Microsoft Dynamics and 23 other vulnerabilities in Microsoft Edge. Now, again, for Windows, Microsoft Windows, we have 38 different vulnerabilities, and others we have Visual Studio, SQL Server, and System Center. We'll talk about all of the vulnerabilities in these applications in detail, as well as we'll take a look at the impacts that these vulnerabilities can cause, and also their CVI. Moving on for now, let's take a look at the patches by impact. So I already mentioned that if these vulnerabilities are left unpatched, these can cause 7 different types of impacts in the vulnerable systems. So starting with denial of service in 10, that is 10 of these vulnerabilities can cause denial of service, while 14 can cause elevation of privilege. 8 can cause information disclosure, while 44, a whopping 44 number of these vulnerabilities can cause remote code execution. While 3 can cause security feature bypass, 9 can cause spoofing, and just 1 can cause tampering. All right, let's take a look at the update severity. So, okay, the patches, if we list them by severity, we can see that 84.7% of these patches this time have been rated as important, while 12.9% of these are critical. But since we have
9 critical vulnerabilities as well as 3 active 0 days, that is 3 0 days that are being actively exploited. It's highly recommended that you test the patches, test and approve the patches, and deploy them to your production machines as soon as possible. Now let's take a look at the operating system and the applications patch. So earlier we saw the impacts that these vulnerabilities can have on those applications. Now let's take a look at all of these applications in detail. So starting with Microsoft Azure. So for Microsoft Azure, as you can see on your screen, we have 4 different vulnerabilities. And fortunately, all 4 of these are important and neither are critical. None of them are critical. So for the impacts, you can see these can cause remote code execution, information disclosure, spoofing, and elevation of privilege. I'll be pausing for a while on all of these slides so that you can take a note of it. Now moving on to Microsoft Exchange Server, again, we have 4 vulnerabilities and none of them are critical. So all 4 of these can cause remote code execution and have been rated as important. For Microsoft Windows, we have critical as well as important vulnerabilities this time. So as far as I know, we have five different critical vulnerabilities in Microsoft Windows this time, which can cause remote code execution, EOP, information disclosure, and denial of service. Let's take a look at the CVIDs. So as you can see on your screens, the ones that have been highlighted in red, these are the critical vulnerabilities in Microsoft Windows. Pausing for a while, you can take a snapshot of it or make a note of it. Next up, here are the rest of the Microsoft Windows vulnerabilities, and all of these are important. That is, the severities have been rated as important. For developer tools, here are the vulnerabilities, CVIDs, that is CVE 2023218008, that is a critical vulnerability, and the other two are important. Now, these vulnerabilities can cause remote code execution and denial of service. So particularly for developer tools, the vulnerabilities have been found in Azure DevOps, in .NET 6.0, in .NET Framework 2.2 Service Pack 2, and in .NET Framework 3.5 and 4.6.2. Now, speaking of the CVE 2023-21808, as I mentioned earlier, that for this vulnerability, an attacker needs to trick the victim to trigger this vulnerability to execute code in the context of the application. Moving on, in Microsoft Office, we have seen six different vulnerabilities this time, with one being critical, and these vulnerabilities can cause RCE, information disclosure, and security feature bypass. Here's a list of the CVIDs. As we can see, one of these are critical. So talking about CVE 2023-21716, I mentioned earlier that this vulnerability, that is CVE 2023-21716, this critical vulnerability affects both Microsoft SharePoint and Microsoft Office applications. And this vulnerability can be used in a preview pane attack. Next, for System Center, we have just two vulnerabilities that are not all important, rated as important, and can cause elevation of privilege and security feature bypass. For Microsoft Apps, we have three CVIDs listed right on the screen that can cause remote code execution. Right now, talking about the Microsoft HoloLens vulnerability, as you can see that this was originally tracked, the vulnerability was originally discovered in 2019 as from the CVID, that is CVE 2019151126. So as per the vendor's website, if we talk about the vulnerability, they had earlier issued that an issue was discovered on Broadcom Wi-Fi client devices. Now talking more about the attack vector. So specifically timed and handcrafted traffic can cause internal errors in a WLAN, that is wireless LAN device, which would lead to improper layer 2 Wi-Fi encryption with a consequent possibility of information disclosure over the air, particularly for a discrete set of traffic. Now, since Broadcom no longer supports their hardware on any of the Windows platforms, hence we don't have any security updates that are available to address this vulnerability. As a result, in this patch Tuesday, Microsoft has recommended its customers that are using HoloLens 1 device with this Wi-Fi client to follow some of the steps to mitigate the vulnerability. Now we'll share the link of the steps to mitigate the vulnerabilities in the chat. You can refer to that, but also I would like to tell you some. So out of the total 6 steps of mitigation that Microsoft has shared, let me tell you a few. That is, first one, Microsoft has recommended the users to update Wi-Fi routers to mitigate security vulnerabilities. Next, they have stated that the users, that is the customers, should use WPA2 Enterprise with certificate-based authentication for HoloLens Wi-Fi. Next, they have also said that they have recommended it that the users shouldn't connect the HoloLens device to untrusted Wi-Fi networks. So they have shared a total of 6 mitigation steps, 6 recommendations that you can find from the link that has been shared in the chat. Okay. Now coming to Microsoft Dynamics vulnerability, we can see that these can cause RCE and spoofing. And here are the 6 CVIDs for the Microsoft Dynamics vulnerability. Moving to Microsoft Edge, this time we saw a total of 23 vulnerabilities, with none of them being critical and their severities ranging from important to moderate and low. So speaking of the impacts, as you can see that these can cause RCE, spoofing, tampering, elevation of privilege, as well as security feature bypass. And here's a look at the CVIDs for the 23 Microsoft Edge vulnerabilities. Hope you have taken a note of it or made a screenshot. Moving on to the Microsoft SQL Server vulnerabilities, we see that we have a critical vulnerability, CVE 2023-21718. So as I mentioned earlier, that this vulnerability affects the Microsoft SQL ODBC driver, and it's a remote code execution vulnerability. And also the vulnerability can be exploited by an attacker, and they can trick an unauthenticated user into connecting to a rogue SQL database. Once the user connects to the rogue SQL database, the attacker can then return malicious data to the user and can cause arbitrary code execution on the vulnerable systems, on the exploited systems. Apart from this remote code execution vulnerability that has been rated as critical, we see 5 other vulnerabilities, as you can see, which can cause spoofing. The CVIDs have been mentioned. For Microsoft Visual Studio, we have 7 vulnerabilities, out of which 3 are critical and can cause RCE. Also, the other impacts are elevation of privilege and denial of service. So CVE 2023-21808, we spoke about this earlier because we saw this vulnerability in Microsoft.NET as well. And also for the other, that is CVE 2023-21815 and 23381, we have already discussed about this earlier, I believe. Since all of these 3 vulnerabilities have been found to be of the similar nature, as they require an attacker to trick the victim to trigger this vulnerability so that they can execute code in the context of the application. Now here's a look at the third-party updates. So this time, out of all the third-party updates released this patch Tuesday, that was basically by Mozilla, Google Chrome. Also, Adobe also has released some of the updates. So these are the updates that you can use to that you can patch on. These are the updates that you can install to your network using Manage Engine's patch management solutions. So ladies and gentlemen, for the third-party updates that were released this month, as well as the non-security updates, as well as their related articles, if you want to know more info about them, you can just refer to Manage Engine's Patch Tuesday forum post. The link to the forum post will be shared in the chat shortly, and you can get a complete note of the detailed breakdown of Patch Tuesday updates based on the number of third-party updates, as well as the non-security articles. So here's a look at the non-security office updates that were released. We see updates for .NET Framework, as well as MS SQL Server Management Studio. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are glad to announce that out of all the patches released in February 2023, Manage Engine's patch management solution, that is Endpoint Central, Patch Manager Plus, and Vulnerability Manager Plus, all these 3 solutions support a total of 1,163 patches. So you can patch your systems with all the 1,163 patches if required. if required, using Manage Engine's patch management solution. Okay, so we are done with the breakdown of Patch Tuesday. Now I'll be showing you how you can simplify patch management in your network's enterprises network with Patch Manage Plus. But before I talk about it, before I go into the demonstration, let's give you a patch management best practice. So as you can see on your screens, we have listed the best practices that you can follow for patching a distributed network. So let me tell about these best practices at first. So first up, it's always recommended to test the patches before deploying them to your production environments. Now we have seen various instances in the past wherein once the patches have been rolled out to the production environment, they create irregularities and anomalies and they end up breaking software because of the bugs present in them. And to prevent all of that, it's always highly recommended that you patch the system, you test the patches in a test group of network before deploying them to the production machines. So only when the patches have been tested and approved successfully, can they be safely deployed to the end users as well as the other production machines. Next, it's always best to prioritize the security and the critical updates for all of the machines. Now, once these security and critical updates have been deployed to the systems, only then should you deploy other non-critical updates such as feature packs, quality rollups, monthly rollups, and updates of less severities with your regular deployment schedules. Number three, it's best if you synchronize the patching schedules for your enterprises network with the monthly patch Tuesdays. So the synchronization of the patching schedules with monthly patch Tuesdays, this is a feature that is available exclusively in Manage Engine's patch management solutions. We'll be demonstrating this in the later slides. But what happens is that if you synchronize the patching schedules with the monthly patch Tuesdays, you get a head start because in that case, you can use the patch Tuesday week for testing and approving the patches once they have been released. And if they are successfully approved, these can be deployed to your production machines. Next, it's always recommended to set broad deployment windows for the remote machines, that is remote users, as well as the network office that was as well as the machines in office, especially the servers. So let's face it, as IT admins, we have a very important task of striking a fine balance between end user productivity as well as the system health compliance of our network. And this is definitely not an easy job. So for that, we need to adhere to certain best practices so that there can be a fine balance between user productivity and our network's compliance. And for that, it's always best to schedule broad deployment windows for the remote users so that they don't have any patch deployment issues due to connectivity or network issues. And also, you can use non-business hours for the office machines and especially for the servers. And lastly, it is recommended that you allow the users to postpone the deployments and reboots. Now, let's say there's a group of users in your organization and they're held up with business critical tasks. Now, forcing the patch deployment or reboot on the systems in that case would definitely lead to productivity drops. And as sysadmins, we definitely don't want that. So it's highly recommended. It's that you allow the users to postpone the deployments and reboots. So in case they are held up with business critical tasks, they can choose to postpone the deployments and reboots, which would be happening at a later date based on the configurations that you make in the application. So as you can see, we also have a free ebook that you can download from the link that has been shared in the chat. So you can get a detailed description of the best practices from the ebook that you can use to patch your systems in the network. All right, so we have discussed about the best practices that can be followed for patching a distributed network. So now let me go to the Patch Manager Plus console and demonstrate how you can put to use these best practices. Coming to the Patch Manager Plus console. So I'm using the version 11.1.224.2.7. And on your screens, you can see the network patch status. This is the home page. You can see the network patch status system health graph, the missing patches based on their severities and vulnerability. Now on the right side of the screen, you can see the latest security news wherein we post regular updates of the vulnerabilities that have been fixed in products such as Google, Chrome, Mozilla, as well as Adobe. And you can also click on the Patch Tuesday forum post to know more about the supported updates that were released in this month's Patch Tuesday. Okay, so now let's talk about the features. So I'll be demonstrating the best practices as I mentioned. So the first best practice was to test the patches before deploying them onto the systems, onto the production machines. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to tell you that I have seen some of the attendees join now. So for those people, I would like to tell you that the webinar is being recorded, and the recording of the webinar as well as the presentation slide deck would be sent to your email IDs in 1 to 2 working days. And also, if you have any queries, please feel free to ask via chat. Our expert panel would be more than happy to answer your questions. All right, coming back to this. So I was talking about the demonstration of testing and approval feature. Right. So we'll go to deployment from the top menu and we'll click on test and approve from the left pane. So as you can see, a lot of test groups have been created to test the patches before deploying them. So let's go ahead and create a new group, clicking on add group. First task is to choose the platform. So as you can see, we offer 3 different types of platforms, that is Windows, Mac, and Linux. Let's go with Windows. You can select a group right from here if you have created one, or you can go ahead with creating a new custom group for testing. So once the window loads up, you can see the custom groups that have been created for various purposes, such as, let's say, declining patches or creating automated patch deployments or custom groups. We'll create a new group and we'll rename it as WebCG, right? Now, the next task is to choose the category. So you can see there are 3 different categories, that is static, static unique, and dynamic. So for a custom group that is used for testing purposes, that is for a test group, it's always mandatory that you choose either a static or a static unique. Now, what happens if I choose a dynamic? So you can see that a dynamic group is based on a set of criteria. So operating system, let's say equal, and my favorite, Windows 11. Yep. So if I choose Microsoft operating system equals Microsoft Windows 11, what happens is that this custom test group will be based on the dynamic criteria, that is operating system equals Windows 11. So any new Microsoft Windows 11 operating system machine, that is any new machine that has the operating system as Windows 11, if they are added to the network, they will automatically be made a part of the test group. And definitely we don't want that dynamic capability for our test group because we want it to be as static as possible. And as a result, let's go ahead with static or static unique. The next task is to just import the computers. From the left pane, we'll just click on the computers that we need to be imported. And as you can see on the right pane, the computers are easily and smoothly imported. So we'll click on save. We can see that our test group has been created successfully. Now that we have created the custom group, the next step, as I said, was to create the test and approve feature. Coming to deployment, test and approve, we'll add the group. So I've already created the test group. It was called Feb, if I correct, yeah, got it, Feb CG 2023. Now the next task is to choose the deployment option. So if you can see that we offer Microsoft updates, third-party updates, as well as antivirus and driver updates. So the updates have been listed based on their severities, going with critical and important for both security and non-security updates. You can obviously go as per your needs. Next up, you'll see an option that is you can choose to patch either all applications or you can choose to patch specific applications. That is, you can choose the specific applications that you want to be patched right from here, or you can choose to patch all applications except a few that you can exclude right from this dropdown. Going with patch all applications. Next is the third-party updates. Again, selecting critical and important for third-party. You can also choose to update antivirus definitions. The list of supported antivirus definitions is given right here. And you can also go ahead with the driver updates. The next task is to choose the deployment of the patches. So let's say you want to deploy the patches after n number of days from vendor release. So in that case, you just put in the number of days. I choose to deploy the patches after 4 days from vendor release. Now you can choose the deployment settings. You can create a new deployment policy, or you can just go ahead with the already existing deployment policy. Next, we have an optional notification settings. So if you want the admins to be notified about the test and approve feature, You can just click on enable notification, and then we'll have to put in the email addresses. You can just put in a random email ID, let's say tv@x.com. And in case you want, if in case you have configured the mobile application, you can just click on the selected technician that has configured the mobile application so that they be notified in the mobile application itself. So if you're not aware, I would like to tell you that that our Manage Engines Patch Manager Plus mobile application is available on Google Play Store as well as App Store. So again, so if you have configured the mobile application already, just select the admin right from here, and then we'll move on to the last step, that is the approval mode for tested patches. So if in case you want to automatically approve the tested patches after n number of days, just click on this box and then put in the number of days. So here I have selected 4 days from the vendor release. That is, the patches will be deployed after 4 days. So let's go ahead with a reasonable number such as 3. So my patches will automatically be tested. And if they're okay, they'll be approved after 3 days, following which the patches will be deployed after 4 number of days from the release. So that's done. We'll click on create, and we can see that our test and approve group has been created successfully. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, along with it, I was also mentioning about some other best practices, such as setting broad deployment windows or synchronizing the patching schedules with the monthly patch Tuesdays, and also allowing the users to postpone the deployments and reboots. We'll demonstrate all of it in detail. In the meanwhile, I would like to tell you that if you want to have certain demonstrations about the product, or if you want to understand in brief about any of the features, you can just request it in the chat box. Also, since we have time constraints in this webinar, I tell you that I won't be able to go in depth for the feature explanations. So in case you want a demo, you want a customized, personalized demo of the features of this product or any of our products, you can just drop in your email IDs in the chat box. Also, once you close the webinar, you will get a survey form where you can just request for a demo by putting in your email IDs. All right, so we are done with the test and approve feature. Now let's talk about the automate patch deployment feature. So now before I begin about the automate patch deployment feature, I would like to tell you that the creation of an automate patch deployment task is a two-step process. So the first task, that is the first step of the process, is to create a deployment policy. And once the deployment policy has been created, you have to associate it with an automate patch deployment task. So let's go ahead with creation of a new deployment policy. So under deployments from the left pane, we'll click on deployment policy. Here are the list of deployment policies that have already been created. We'll create a new policy. Let's rename the policy as Feb 23 DP. Now, the first task is to choose the deployment schedule. So if you remember, I was talking about the patch Tuesday based split. That is, it's always recommended to choose the patch Tuesday based split as a best practice for patching. So what is it? How do you do that? I'll show you. First up, you can see on the weekly split type, we have the regular split and the based on patch Tuesday split. So in regular split, what happens is that if it's chosen, the weeks would be listed as first, second, third, fourth, and last. And also the days will be listed on. Now we can either choose that or we can go ahead with the based on patch Tuesday split. So once we click on based on patch Tuesday split, you can see that the weeks have been changed and they have been listed based on the patch Tuesday. So let's say we go ahead with the patch Tuesday week for testing and approval of the patches. So the subsequent weeks, that is the first, second, and third week, we can use this for deployment. We'll be choosing in broad deployment windows. Let's keep it as broad as possible for seamless deployment. And definitely add more than one schedules if required. Next is the downloading of patches from the server to the agent. So you can choose to download the patches from the server to the agent only either during the deployment window or anytime the agent contacts the server. Next, you can choose to initiate the deployment at either the system startup, that is, in case when the system starts up during this specified deployment window, in case the system starts up, In that case, the deployment will be initiated or during the refresh cycle, that is the 90-minute agents and server refresh cycle that we have, and either of these, whichever happens earlier. We'll click on save and continue. The next task is to choose the pre-deployment activities. Now the name is pretty self-explanatory. So pre-deployment activities mean that if you want certain customized activities to happen to the endpoints before patch deployment, you can just select them right from here. So you can choose to wake systems that are connected to LAN with the wake on LAN feature. In case you want to deploy, you want to reboot, that is you want to reboot the systems before the deployment, you can just click on pre-deployment reboot and select it. And we also offer an exclusive custom script option. So what this does is that, let's say you want certain custom activities to be performed on the endpoints before patch deployment. Like let's say you have a VM that is a virtual machine and you want to have a snapshot of the configurations of the virtual machine before deployment. You can easily do that by creating a custom script and then just importing it from the repository here and adding the respective arguments and dependency files. You can, let's say, also use the custom script to kill an application that is running in your endpoints before the deployment happens. All right, so for now, let's go ahead with pre-deployment reboot. So you can choose to skip the reboot for systems that don't require a reboot, or also you can choose to exclude the reboot for servers. Now you can also notify the users about the reboot by putting in a custom message, and then we'll click on save and continue. Next, we'll have an user notification. That is the third step of the creation of a deployment policy, is the user notification. Now, you can choose to notify the users about the deployment by putting in custom notifications right here. And as we discussed earlier, that it is a best practice to always give the users the option to skip the deployment. You can easily do that by clicking on allow users to skip deployment. Also, you can choose to show the deployment progress on the client systems by clicking on this checkbox. Lastly, the fourth activity is post-deployment activities. That is, if you want certain activities to be performed on the endpoints after the deployment has happened, you can just click on this and you can just drag and drop the activities. Let's say with custom script, you can restart the applications that were running in your endpoints before the deployment happened. And with post reboot or shutdown, you can choose to either reboot the systems after the deployment has happened, or you can also choose to exclude reboot for some or certain machines that don't require a reboot or for the servers. We'll click on save and continue, and here's a gist of the deployment policy. You can see the deployment schedule as well as the pre-deployment and post-deployment settings and activities. Now we'll click on save and continue. So as you can see that our deployment policy has been created successfully. Now, as I was mentioning, that the creation of an automate patch deployment task is a two-step process. So we have created the deployment policy as the first step. Now the next task is to associate it with an automate patch deployment task. So we'll click on automate patch deployment task and we'll click on automate task to create a new one. Going with Windows. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to tell you again that due to time constraints, I would not be able to go for an in-depth demonstration of the features. So in case you want a demo of any of the features of this product of Patch Manager Plus or any of our products, please feel free to drop in your email IDs in the chat. Or also when you close the webinar, you'll receive a feedback form wherein you can put in your email IDs to request for a demo of any of the products. So I was talking about the automate patch deployment task. Now we'll create a new APD task, that is automate patch deployment task, and associate a deployment policy. Now the first task is to select the applications. We'll click and select those applications based on their severities. Same for third-party updates. You can choose to do it for antivirus updates, that is you can update antivirus definitions and driver updates. Next, if you want to deploy the patches after n number of days from release or approval, you can do that easily by putting in the number of days. Next, we have to choose the deployment settings. So here under deployment option, you can see that we have two different features. Either you can choose to deploy the patches or you can choose to publish them to a self-service port. Now, why is this useful? So let's say you are a server owner and we all know that patching a server is a Herculean task. You have to go for a planned downtime, and only after the planned downtime is selected and approved, can you publish the patches? That is, can you deploy the patches to the system, to the servers? So for that, from the IT admin's perspective, the IT admin can just easily publish the patches to a self-service portal. So once you select this option, you will see that there is no option of a deployment policy. This is because once the patches have been published to the self-service portal by the IT admin, the server owner can choose the server owner, or let's say owners of certain sector of the machines. So let's say they can choose the downtime based on their own needs. And once the downtime has been chosen successfully based on their requirements, they can easily just select the patches from the self-service portal, and then they can deploy it to the machines. So going ahead with deploy again. So you can just select a deployment policy from right here. Just go ahead with this one. And in case you want to publish the patches to self-service portal as well as deploy them, you can just toggle the checkbox. Now you can also choose to suspend the task after, that is suspend the automate patch deployment task after a particular date and time, and then we'll click on next. Now you have to choose the targets that wherein we want the automate patch deployment task to happen. Go ahead with the local office, and you can also choose to exclude certain computers based on domains, OUs, custom groups, as well as IP address and range. The last step is to configure the notifications. So if you want your admins, if you want the admins to be notified about the test and about the automate patch deployment, you can just click on the notify download or deployment failure, wherein you can be notified after every n number of hours. You can also attach detailed reports that are available in PDF, CSV, and XLSX format. You can also notify the deployment status report for every, that is after every n number of hours, and can go for a detailed report attachment. You'll have to just put in the email IDs right here. And again, if you have configured the mobile application that is available on the patch on the Google Play Store as well as the App Store, just select the technician, and the technician will be notified about the automate patch deployment task right in their mobile phones. We'll click on save. And as you can see, our automate patch deployment task has been created successfully. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that since we are running out of time, we have to cut short our demonstration. So right now we'll be open for the question and answer session. So if you have any queries regarding the presentation or any of our products, please feel free to ask via chat. Again, if you want a demonstration of any of the features of the product, let's say the self-service portal or our integration with Tenable.io, please feel free to drop your email IDs in the chat. We'll be setting up a demo session for you. You can also put in your email IDs in the survey form that you will get once you close the webinar for a demo request. Now, before moving on to the question and answer section, I would like to tell you that here are the solutions of Manage Engine that we offer for seamless patch management. So first up, we have our flagship product, Endpoint Central, which is a unified endpoint management and security solution. We also have an MSP version of the product. We have Patch Connect Plus that smoothly integrates with SCCM and Intune to ensure third-party patching. You can use Vulnerability Manager Plus to scan and mitigate vulnerabilities and compliance issues in your network. And last but not the least, we have Patch Manager Plus, our standalone patch management solution that ensures seamless patching across the network. So now we are open for questions. Please feel free to ask if you have any questions regarding the webinar or any of our products or features. We'll be more than happy to answer. All right, so I have a question by Mr. Arjun. He asks, what is the difference between patch management and Patch Manager Plus? So Mr. Arjun, patch management is a process. So patch management means the entire process of identifying the missing patches in your endpoint, then scanning the missing endpoints again for missing patches, then testing the patches and getting them approved, and finally deploying those patches to your machines and getting them installed. So this entire process is called patch management process. However, on the other hand, Patch Manager Plus is Manage Engine's standalone solution that lets you patch Windows, Mac, and Linux, as well as 850 third-party applications, all of this right from a single console. I hope that answers your question. Moving on to Karen. So the question is published to SSP a new feature? I don't see that in my console. So Karen, the feature is supposed to be there and it's not actually published to SSP a new feature. Could you just kindly send us your build number so that we can check which build you are using? We have a question. So Tara asks, I have signed up for all the video webinars, not just past Tuesday. I haven't received any videos in my email after the training. Is there a link? So definitely. So we have sent all of the videos, but I'm really sorry for this inconvenience that you have faced, that you haven't received the videos. We'll definitely talk to the support team and expedite the process so that all of the webinar videos are sent to you as soon as possible. So I have another question by Glenn. This has been answered already. Okay. So Mark asks, please, can you send the training videos? Yeah, definitely, Mark. We'll be sending the Patch Tuesday recording to your registered email IDs in 1 to 2 working days. So there's a question by Dan. Do we need asset scan before patch scan? All right. So Dan, I would like to tell you that with Patch Manager Plus currently, I'm not really sure I understand your question, but as per my understanding currently, I'll tell you that with Patch Manager Plus, all you have to do is just install the agents in your systems and the patch scanning would begin automatically. So there's really no need to for having an asset scan before the patch scan. So once the agents are installed in the systems, the scanning would begin automatically and the missing patches would be updated. I'm sorry, the missing patches in the systems would be updated right in the Patch Manager Plus console. So there's no need for an asset scan before that. Again, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any queries, please feel free to ask via chat. We'll be trying to answer as many questions as possible. Ladies and gentlemen, in case you are done with your questions and you are exiting the webinar, I would request you to rate the webinar from 1 to 5, with 5 being the best. Again, once you close the webinar, you will get the survey form wherein you can send in your email IDs for a demo session. And also, we are still open for questions. Please feel free to ask any questions if you have. I see a lot of claps in the chat. Thank you so much for the lovely responses. Thank you. Thank you so much for the lovely responses. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask via chat. We'll be more than happy to help you. Yeah, so Frank asks, do you have an unified solution that has all solutions, that is endpoint management, vulnerability management, patching, and so on? Yeah, definitely, Frank. We have our flagship unified endpoint management and security solution, that is Endpoint Central. With Endpoint Central, you can have vulnerability mitigation, patch management, operating system deployment, software deployment, remote access, as well as a bunch of other features that also include anti-ransomware, application control, and so on. You can definitely share your email ID in the chat box if you want a demo of Endpoint Central right now, Frank. Hope that answers your query. Again, dear guests, we are open for questions. So if you have any queries, please feel free to ask via chat. Ladies and gentlemen, we are still open for questions. If you have no questions and you are exiting the webinar, you can rate the session from 1 to 5, with 5 being the best. But again, we'll be trying to answer all of the questions that are currently open. So Arjun asks if you have any session which can help to deploy in closed network. Yeah, definitely. We with Patch Manager Plus as well as any of Manage Engine's patch management solutions, we can do patching for demilitarized, that is DMZ zones or air gap zones. That is, you can also refer to them as closed networks. We'll be sharing the link for this in the chat right now. Okay, so Tara asks, I am having issues with enrolling a virtual machine to the Endpoint Central. Definitely, Tara will like to help you with your issue so that you can resolve it. In case if you have issues, please feel free to reach out to your support team. Yeah, Rajat asks, would we be able to get the recorded video for this tutorial? Yeah, definitely, Rajat, as I mentioned earlier. So the webinar recording will be shared to your email IDs in 1 to 2 working days. We'll also share the slide deck of the presentation to your email IDs. So there's nothing to worry about. So Tom asks specifically, how can I find CVE 2023 212823 patch has been downloaded? So Tom, you can, I'm not really sure what you mean, but you can definitely move to missing patches to see if this patch is still missing in your endpoints. You can just go to the missing patches section and find the respective patch that you're looking for. Hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, please feel free to ask again. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I believe there are no further questions. So in that case, we'll just be closing the session now. Okay, so thank you everyone. Thank you for joining. See you all again next month. Have a great day.